Welcome back to another retro review. Darius by Taito was released to the arcades in 1986 and launched an entire series of shooters that continues on even today, with the last new game, Darius Burst CS, in 2015, and numerous ports of the classic arcade and console entries as recent as 2021. In this video, I'm taking a look at Darius Gaiden, the third arcade game and fifth overall game in the series. This entry is considered by many to be the best Darius games and one of the best shmups ever made. But before I get into Darius Gaiden, let me introduce you to the series itself. Like I said, Darius first came to the arcades in 1986. This was a horizontally scrolling shooter, and while there were many of these kinds of games circulating arcades at the time, Darius managed to break the molds of your typical arcade shooter. To start, the game's play area spans 3 monitors for an ultra-widescreen experience and used mirrors to make the appearance that the screens were continuous. Unlike many games at the time, such as Gradius, this one allowed for 2 players simultaneously, and the cabinet was designed as if you were sitting in the cockpit of an actual spaceship. What's even more eye-catching is the game's visuals. While you pilot your typical spaceship, the backgrounds are detailed with you traveling through caves and bizarre locations. The enemies are mostly fish-themed, and at the end of each stage you fight a giant battleship modeled after some kind of fish, crustacean, or cephalopod. Unlike many other games, when you complete a level, you get a choice to branch off into one of 2 stages. This gives the game tons of replayability, as you'll have to play through multiple times to see all the stages. Darius 2 was released in 1989 and followed in the same style as the original Darius, including the 3-monitor setup. This sequel added more power-ups as well as mini-bosses, but the gameplay was mostly the same. Darius received a few ports to the PC Engine in Japan, and Darius 2 received ports to the PC Engine, Sega Master System, and Sega Genesis. The Sega ports were renamed Sagaya for some reason. There are also several exclusive home Darius games, including the SNES game Darius Twin, a Game Boy entry called Sagaya, which is not the same as Darius 2, and the SNES game called Darius Force in Japan, or Supernova in North America. By the mid-1990s, Taito was looking to release another arcade Darius, and Darius Gaiden would be the result. An entirely new team worked on this one, and they wanted to redesign the gameplay while still capturing the aspects of the originals that made them unique and interesting. They ditched the 3-monitor design and went with a single-screen horizontal shooter. The gameplay would be faster, more intense, with new game mechanics. The fish and ocean visual themes would remain, along with the giant battleships, and the branching paths would also be there. Everything else, from the visual effects, music, and gameplay elements, were experimental, and in this case, worked to make the game an amazing experience. Darius Gaiden hit arcades in both Japan and the United States in 1994, with a Sega Saturn port in 1995, a Sony Playstation port in Japan only in 1996, and a Windows 95 port worldwide in 1997. Gaiden is also available on both the PlayStation 2 and original Xbox in the Taito Legends 2 collection, and is part of M2 Shot Trigger's Darius Cosmic Collection, released on the Nintendo Switch, PlayStation 4, and PC in 2019. I played the original arcade version on MAME, the Japanese Saturn version, in which I own a copy, and even tried the US Saturn version on my optical drive emulated Saturn. There are differences between each version, and some are much better than others. I'll cover the differences at the end of the video, but for now, let's take a look at the game itself. Darius Gaiden takes place between Darius 1 and 2. The people of planet Darius were forced to flee their dying world after the battle in the first game, but after many years were preparing to return to the planet as it was recovering. That's when they were attacked by an unknown enemy. Many of their ships were destroyed, but the remaining Silverhawk gunships set out for planet Darius to find answers and destroy the enemy. The opening sequence is an impressive showing of 32-bit 2D graphics, showing off tons of rotation and scaling. This animation looks really nice, but I have to warn you, if you're playing the PS1 version, it was replaced with incredibly ugly CGI openings. Once on the title screen, you can choose your options or start the game if you're playing one of the ports. The Saturn version allows you to remap your buttons if you want, which is nice, and change the difficulty. There's easy, normal, and hard, but you can use a cheat code to unlock an even more difficult setting, as well as a very easy mode. When you start the game, you're thrown immediately into the action. You have 8-way control of your ship, the Silverhawk, and the movement is very smooth and responsive, with very little lag. Unlike the games such as Gradius, you don't receive any speed-ups. Instead, you have a constant movement speed throughout the game. The controls are sensitive enough that you can make minor adjustments to micro-dodge enemy bullets, or make sweeping movements across the screen. Unlike earlier arcade entries, holding the fire button allows you for rapid fire, though you can still tap if you want. Rapid fire is pretty fast, but if you can tap faster than the rapid fire frequency, you'll be able to fire even faster. This is really beneficial for shooting bosses at point-blank range. You also fire both your primary weapon and bombs with the same button, so you no longer have to hold two buttons constantly like the previous games. In addition to your main weapons, you also have a limited supply of screen-clearing attacks known as the Black Hole Bomb. You start with 3 and can acquire more throughout the stage. When you die, you'll be restocked with 3 more Black Hole Bombs. Just like previous Darius games, killing certain enemies will drop power-ups. These enemies are conveniently colored the same as the power-up that they drop. Red power-ups level up your main gun. You start with missiles, and once you level up your missiles enough, it'll convert to the laser, then finally the wave beam. When you die, you'll be downgraded to the previous weapon type for the first time, then always back to base missiles for any death after that. Even though your main weapon gets downgraded, the game doesn't become impossible when you die. This is because the base weapon, missiles, have the highest damage per second of all of the weapons. The laser is weaker, but can pass through enemies. And the wave is pretty weak, but will also pass through enemies and obstacles. There are advantages to each weapon, and there's no time when having a lower level weapon leaves you at a significant disadvantage. You'll also be able to upgrade your bombs and your armor. Unlike the primary weapon, these don't lose power when you die, though they will reset if you have to use a continue. Picking up a blue icon will give you a shield. This will allow you to take a few more hits before you die, and makes the game feel much more manageable. This leads me to a major criticism I have with not just Gaiden, but the entire Darius series, and that's the hitbox. Unlike Gradius, which I praised for having a much smaller hitbox compared to the size of the Vic Viper's sprite, the Silverhawk in Darius is a rather large ship, and the entire ship is the hitbox. This makes dodging in between enemy bullets very difficult, and ultimately, you just need to avoid getting in those situations as they can be instant death. Many enemy bullets are also pretty large, and the screen can feel pretty cluttered. I really do like that when you die, you will respawn exactly where you left off with no break in the action instead of having checkpoints. If you use a continue, a support ship will drop a whole bunch of power-ups, so you don't feel that you're not too much at a disadvantage. The game definitely plays fair with you. Speaking of continues, if you're emulating the arcade version or playing the M2 port, you have unlimited continues, but all console versions restrict you to 3 credits per player. When I was playing the Saturn version, and after using all 3 of my continues, I would switch to player 2 as a workaround to getting 3 more continues. At first, this is the only way for me to get a chance to practice the later stages. The Saturn version does have a cheat code though that increases your credits to 9. If I had to rank the difficulty of this game, I'd say it's somewhere in the middle of the pack of arcade shooters. It's not super easy, but it's also not seemingly impossible either. A beginner should be able to make it through at least the first 2 to 3 stages on the easy path with 3 credits given by the Saturn version. This is very much a game where you need to learn what is ahead of you to succeed. Knowing enemy patterns, especially the giant battleship bosses, is essential. Like previous games, you'll choose a path after every stage, and there are a total of 28 stages. There are also 8 different endings depending on which final stage you arrive at. In order to see every stage and ending in the game, you'll need multiple playthroughs, which gives this game a ton of replay value. Each stage is unique in design to the point that it's worth it to try every stage at least once. Another really cool feature of this game is the mini-bosses. Each stage has one, and somewhere on its body is a glowing orb. If you manage to do enough damage to the orb before destroying the mini-boss, the orb will detach, Collecting the orb allows you to take control of the mini-boss, and it will fight on your side until enemies destroy it. This was really fun, and it adds a new dimension to the gameplay, as you'll have to be careful not to destroy or do too much damage to the mini-boss's hull while trying to unlatch the orb. Boss fights were the most fun part of the game for me. There are 19 different bosses, so some repeat, but never on the same run. They all run through a distinct set of patterns, so you'll need to learn how each pattern works. Several bosses also have body parts that can be destroyed, which eliminates a weapon, making the fight more manageable. Ultimately though, I use my black hole bombs to do a lot of massive damage and absorb bullets from different bosses. I like that some of the classic bosses from previous Darius games have returned as well, such as King Fossil and Fatty Glutton. The graphics in this game are amazing for their time and hold up even today. Each stage has a unique background and layout. You might be in space in an asteroid field, inside a giant space station, an underground cave, underwater, or even in a weird space warp while traveling through hyperspace. Backgrounds have tons of layers of overlapping parallax, and lots of interesting animation effects. There's also a lot of transparencies, and even the Saturn utilizes the transparency functionality of VDP2 instead of rendering a bunch of ugly dithered meshes. Objects in the background will scale and rotate, and sometimes enemies even start out moving around in the background before entering the play area. The sprites in this game are also really detailed and colorful. Sprite scaling is clean, and even when larger scaled, looks detailed and smooth without being too pixelated. Objects in the background and foreground are delineated well, and I very rarely mistook a foreground object for a background object. Explosions look good, and the animation of the boss's death sequence really steals the show. It's a great reward for the effort put into destroying that boss. The style of the graphics really adds to the strange and wondrous atmosphere, and the sound design only adds to that atmosphere. The music is operatic at times, with eerie vocals, and the style of music is unique to this game. It's hard to explain the style, so I'll give you a few examples of this amazing soundtrack. The entire presentation of the game really makes this stand out, whether you're playing the arcade original or a console port. So let's take a look at the differences for most versions. Some of these I don't own or don't have a good way to play, so I'll just stick to the ones that I could play and that I know. The arcade version on MAME plays great and is an excellent representation of the arcade PCB. The Saturn version, graphically, is almost exactly the same, including all the scaling, rotation, parallax, and transparency effects. The only real difference is that the Saturn version actually plays about 2% slower than the arcade version, and of course there are loading times in between stages. There are also some idiosyncrasies between the scoring and rank between the arcade and Saturn version, but it's not something you'll generally notice unless you're just doing a real deep dive into the game. I did notice minor slowdown on the Saturn version on a few bosses, and for some reason the death animation of the Stage 1 boss triggers slowdown that's not seen in the arcade. Overall, I rank the Saturn version very highly, and it's a good one to play. The PlayStation version, unfortunately, is not that well designed. It runs at an inconsistent speed and has much more slowdown than the Saturn version. The graphics aren't as good with some rendering issues, and it's an overall inferior port. Also, the original cutscenes are replaced with really bad CGI, probably to satisfy Sony Computer Entertainment America's policy that every game had to have 3D graphics, though this version was never released outside of Japan. The PS2 and Xbox versions on the Taito collection is an emulated version of the game, but has some problems. Scaling and rotation are much choppier compared to the arcade and the Saturn version, and the control seems much less responsive. The emulation lag really makes this version difficult. The PS2 version also runs only in interlaced mode, and many of the effects look really bad due to the interlacing. The game is still playable, but I would recommend any version other than this one. Finally, the M2 port in the Darius Cosmic Collection is probably the best rendition to the arcade. M2 does an amazing job with these arcade ports and very faithfully reproduces the true arcade experience. On top of that, there is also practice modes added, which is incredibly beneficial to learning the stages and bosses. This is the version I would recommend for someone looking to get into this game or the series in general. Overall, this is an amazing experience, and if you haven't tried this game yet, you really need to take a look at it. This is an essential shmup to play, and even gamers that aren't really into shmups all that much will enjoy the unique atmosphere created by the graphics and sound design. The challenge is fair, and every time that I got a game over, I wanted to get right back in the action and try again. After my first completion, I wanted to keep playing to see all the other endings as well. This game is truly a masterpiece in game design. Let me know what your experiences are with this game in the comments. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Until then.